David and Goliath. Now, I think that this story that we see in the Bible, specifically in 1 Samuel chapter 17, is a story that is truly, authentically a childhood classic. If you've been with us on Loving the Scriptures, you know that we've been going through a series where we've been looking at different stories in the Bible that we, if you've ever grown up in the church, may consider childhood classics. Some, can be considered classics, and some maybe they don't think of them as so much as classics, so much as some other people might. But David and Goliath, I think, would be universally a one that could be pinned a childhood classic in anybody's mind who grew up in the church, or grew up in a Christian home. And it's actually it had been a personal favorite of my nieces when they were growing up. So there's something very special about the story. But aside from the fact that David was a young boy who killed a giant, we want to look deeper in the sense of we want to look at David as a person in the midst of this situation and what we can learn from him, and also what we can learn about the God that he serves, and which also by extension is the God that we serve, especially since we are one in Christ. So we want to take a look at that. I think there's some good observations that we can glean from the text as we look at this. So I think that we're in for some good things. I hope you stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. Now, 1 Samuel chapter 17 is a long chapter. Again, we're dealing with a lengthy text here. So this isn't anything where we're going to go necessarily verse by verse or section by section. I mean, we're going to cover some of the highlights, and I might make some summary statements, just as it relates to certain areas of the text. But David and Goliath is the story that we're going to be looking at. Again, as I mentioned before, this is part of our series that I call Childhood Classics. And we're going to look at David and Goliath now, and then we have one more story to go in our series. Again, it might be something next week that we might cover in one episode. If not, we can cover it in two. But think about, if you've been with us and if you've been listening faithfully, just the stories that we've covered in this series, and think in your mind, this is just a little fun thing, a little fun game you can play with yourself, and just kind of thinking, what story that's popular with children do you think that we're going to cover next week? Can you guess? Now, here's the thing: I have mentioned it before as an upcoming episode in one of the past episodes over the past several weeks. Try not to cheat by going back and listening and trying to find what story that is. But can you guess in your mind, what the last story is going to be after we get done with David and Goliath? Think about it, and then you'll find out whether you're right or wrong come next time. But for now, what we're doing is we're focusing on David and Goliath, and again, like I said, it's a story that I think can definitely be. I don't think there's any sort of controversy. Let's put it this way: I don't think there's any sort of controversy in making the decision of pinning that as a childhood classic. But again, just like all the other stories that we've looked at, we want to look at it in a little bit of a deeper sense, outside of the perspective of looking at it through the eyes of a child. And just kind of gleaning some of the heavier meaning, some of the examples, some of the principles that we can observe and that we can learn from this, learn from these stories, and seeing how they can be applied to us today. And so, here I think we have a good lineup in store just as far as what we're going to look at here with this story. We've looked at David. In his not so good moment. If you remember a few months ago, I'd probably say a few months ago, we took a couple of weeks to look at David's episode of his sin with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah, and then looking at Psalm 51, David's confession of that sin. That was a little while back, so we visited David's life before, and that was in at a time when he was certainly not at his best. Here in 1 Samuel 17, we see David at his very best. I mean, coming up to this time, he's only been in the story of 1 Samuel for maybe like a chapter, or maybe two, maybe actually. No, just one chapter, or maybe even half a chapter. We're just getting introduced to David, I guess I should say, when we're coming into chapter 17. He's first introduced to the story in 1 Samuel chapter 16, when Samuel, the prophet, or judge, he was actually a judge, one of the last judges in the period of the judges. But he had after the failure of Saul in his kingship because he wasn't obedient to the Lord directed Samuel to go to the house of Jesse to find the next king of Israel. And so Jesse had all of his sons pass by him until they got to the youngest, who was out tending the sheep because he was a shepherd. If you're familiar with David, you're familiar with his story, you know that he was a shepherd. So they called him in from the field, and God pretty much indicated to Samuel that he was the one. He was the one who was going to be the next king of Israel, and so he was anointed as such. Now, for much a good chunk of what you see in the story of 1 Samuel, you don't see David ascended to the throne. David's got quite a journey to get from where he is when he's introduced to the story to the throne. There's going to be some hardship ahead, but as David is introduced into this story, we don't really, let's put it this way, we don't really hear much from David in this first chapter where he appears in chapter 16. We just know that he appears before Samuel. He's anointed king over Israel. So that's set. That's done. David knows that there's a future throne in his life that's going to be coming up at some point. He's been anointed of God by Samuel to fill that role. Right now, the person who's occupying that spot was Saul. And as I mentioned before, Saul turned out to be a huge disappointment because he was one who did not follow the Lord and did not follow his instructions. And so it had been told to Saul that the throne would be given to one who was better than him. But one of the things that you see in Samuel is how the Lord kind of shows more favor to David and is leaving Saul. And in the middle of chapter 16, one of the things that you read about Saul is that the Holy Spirit left him in a tormentous spirit, an evil spirit descended upon him. And this was something that apparently would come and go. This was something that tormented him pretty often. I can only imagine. I mean, that must have been something. It was not something that I would imagine would be fun. But the cure for that, I mean, whenever that came up, would be for somebody to play music for the king, and then he would be all calm. I think the spirit would leave him and everything like that. And so somebody knew about David, who played the harp, so he was a musician also. So David was brought into the king's service to play music for the king whenever he had these different episodes. So he was brought into the service of the king, and he would serve the king in that way. Now, one of the things that you see in chapter 17, one thing that you learn is that David goes back and forth between serving the king and also keeping his father's flock. So he's still performing shepherding duties. So he hasn't left that entirely, but he goes back and forth between the king and his father and his household, and tending and looking after the sheep. Now, it's David's occupation as a shepherd that's going to play in big to his insight and his attitude towards going up against somebody like Goliath when you get to chapter 17. So in chapter 16, you really don't get much information about the man himself. I mean, what kind of person he is. All we really know is that he's anointed king over Israel. okay, and that he's called to Saul's service to play the harp for him whenever he's tormented by the Spirit. That's all that we really have, okay? When you get to chapter 17 and when you get to the story about David and Goliath, you start to see the character of somebody whose heart and soul is deeply rooted in the person of God, and one who is very concerned. I don't know if concerned is the right word. It's the only one. It's one who is very passionate. Let's say that. One who is very passionate about the Lord's glory. And especially as it relates to how the Lord's enemies come up against the Lord's army. And by the Lord's army, I mean it's an army that belongs to the Lord God himself. The Lord God is the one who is the true leader of the army, okay? And so we're going to see some tremendous things and some good insight into how David approaches this and why he's so bold and why he's so confident in going up against a giant, a Philistine champion, and having this confidence that he will be able to beat him. Okay, so that's what we have going on here that we have laid forth ahead. So let's meet our nemesis here. If you're familiar with Scripture, you know, and as we've mentioned several times already, we know that that our nemesis, our enemy, in this story is a man named Goliath. And so he's introduced, well, actually, let me just start at the beginning of the chapter. I was going to start in verse 4, but let me just to get some momentum going into these verses in introducing Goliath into the story. Let's start at the beginning of the chapter. So this is 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 1, and it says, "Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soco, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soco and Azekah, and Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp," here's our introduction here, "and there came," verse 4, "and there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield bearer went before him." Now let's stop right there, just having gone through all that description of this man, Goliath. So here he's introduced into the story, and we're given some description as far as his appearance. And the number one glaring thing that we know, and if we're familiar with the story, we know the number one thing that we know about Goliath is that he was a huge guy. He was a giant, right? And it says there in verse 4, verse 5. No, excuse me, verse 4. I've got to get my stuff together here. Verse 4 says that his height was 6 cubits and a span. Okay, so basically, just to convert that to feet and inches, we're talking about somebody who's 9 feet 9 inches tall. So a few inches short of 10 feet. Now that's pretty big. Now, I remember, I think it was this last season on, I don't know if anybody watches America's Got Talent, but there was a team of 3 guys from India who had this. It was kind of a danger act. It was kind of a danger act sort of thing that they did. And one of the guys that was on that team was a big, huge guy. And if I remember correctly, I should have looked this up. But I think that his height was, he was like 7 foot something inches tall. I mean, we look at anybody who's 7 feet tall, and we think that, that's a pretty big guy. And he did look pretty big. I mean, on the screen, he looked pretty big. I'm pretty sure that if you're standing next to him in person, he looks a lot bigger than that. So 7 feet tall, and then, some whatever inches. I don't remember how many inches past 7 feet this guy was. That's pretty big. Here with Goliath, we're talking about somebody who's just shy of 10 feet tall. Okay, so he's pretty big. He's pretty big. Now it's talked about this coat of mail, and it's just another way of describing his armor. The kind of armor that he wore, and so it says that that his coat of mail. And he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels, which comes out to about 125 pounds. So that's, for something like that, that's pretty heavy. But of course, that's something that's suitable for somebody like Goliath, who's somebody with that size. His spearhead, I think it said, was 600 cubits. That's about 15 pounds. Okay, so all of this description that's made about Goliath is to give the reader the impression that we're dealing with a big dude, and we're dealing with his height in itself. The height in itself is no ordinary thing. I think that's one of the impressions that we're supposed to get. I mean, you're in that time, whether in Philistia or among the people of Israel, having been engaged against the people like the Philistines for so long. I think the idea is that you'd be hard-pressed to run into a Philistine who was that big. This was not normal. It was not normal to come across a guy this big within the people of the Philistines, okay? So Goliath was an unusual specimen, but he was a very unusual but intimidating specimen as well. And Goliath knew, that he had that intimidation factor against the people of Israel. And you see as much as you read through the story. So when you continue here, let's get a load of the words that he says and the challenge, specifically the challenge that he extends to the people of Israel. It says in verse 8, it says, he stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourself and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Okay, so here comes Goliath, kind of giving his fee-fi-fo-fum speech, I guess, if you want to call it something like that. And what you'll learn later on in the text is that this is a regular routine. In fact, actually, I'm looking down here at verse 16, where it says, "For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening." So this is something. So twice a day, I guess you could say, for 40 days, he would come out and give this challenge. And he was relentless. I mean, he hasn't really attacked anybody yet, but I mean, with the way that the Israelites were so afraid of this guy, you can kind of maybe sense the fact that Goliath was a very effective bully. But here you have Goliath challenging Israel to come to send somebody from their ranks to do hand-to-hand combat with him. Now, of course, he knows that there's nobody who measures up in size alone, not even to mention skill. Saul's going to mention Goliath's skill later on. We'll look at that here in a few minutes. But so you have a big, huge guy who's also very skillful. And you have nobody, and I think he knows this, there's nobody on the side of Israel who sizes up literally to somebody like Goliath. Now, he's saying, look, if you can find somebody who can come and kill me, then we'll be your servants. And goodness, I guess that would be quite a prize because, talk about being a severe underdog in that sort of case. But of course, the bet goes the other way too, where Goliath says, if I slay him, then you guys have to serve us. And with Goliath being one who's heavily favored, I think Israel understands that, there's a good chance that if we follow through with what this guy says, that we'd be pretty foolish because this guy will probably squash whoever we send out there. It will squash him like a bug. It'll squash him like a bug, and then we will be slaves of the Philistines. So there's kind of like this standstill. Israel is a group of people, the army anyway, is a group of people that are ready for battle. Goliath has something different in mind. You notice the question that he asked there. He says, why do you line up for battle? Why don't you just send one person to me to do hand-to-hand combat? If you can get one person to kill me, I think the essence is, and surely I think everybody else in your army would be able to defeat the Philistine army. And so what use would there to be fighting? So you can send one person to kill me, then that's it. Then we give up and we'll submit to you in slavery, in servitude. And so that's the idea here. But as we read there at the end of that description there, in verse 11, it says, when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Ever been there before? Ever been dismayed and greatly afraid? I mean, we're not just talking about just a little bit, scared, shivered down your spine. These people were terrified. That's the idea that we should be getting here. Now, just, a noteworthy thing here, it says, when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines. So you single out Saul here. Saul is the king, the current king of Israel. When David comes on the scene in the story, we're talking about the future second king of Israel. And the attitude and the outlook on how to approach this Goliath thing is like night and day. Saul is very much terrified, and David is one who says, "Let me at him. Let me at him." Now we're gonna see the mindset of David and where he's coming from. And so one of the advantages I think that David has is that he has experience behind him of what God is able to do that gives him confidence that he will be able to stand up against this Philistine, something that Saul and the rest of the army didn't have necessarily. But nevertheless, I think one thing I'll just bring this up now. One thing that surprises me about this is that I'm pretty sure that all of Israel is aware of their history. Okay. That's just something that you don't forget. I mean, in a culture like that, in a time like that, history was very important. Surely they would have had to have known how God helped the Israelites and when they first came into the land to defeat giants, right? What was one of the things that the first generation of Israelites were afraid of? We talked about this last week when we were talking about Joshua, right? They're giants. We're like grasshoppers to them. And, they said that we can't do it. And so, what happened with that first generation? God told them to take a walk, and they ended up taking a 40-year stroll through the wilderness. Now, when the second generation comes along, God comes through for them and is able to help them defeat the enemies on the west side of the Jordan River. Okay, not to mention the fact that second generation had firsthand experience in defeating Sihon and Og, the Amorite kings on the east side of the Jordan, which in land that wasn't even designated to be theirs. So if God was able to do that, then surely he would give them the ability to defeat the giants that are on the other side of the Jordan in the land that God intended for them to take over, right? So here you have a giant, and this is just one giant, okay? If they understood who they were and who they belonged to, you might think that there would be somebody within that group that would, like a Caleb or a Joshua in the story that we looked at before, who could say, look, I can take this Philistine or what have you. But that really didn't register in people's minds at the moment listen, you had the power of a visual aid is very powerful. And so looking at this Philistine and seeing how big he is, seeing that kind of does something to somebody. And, you see them and they're like, none of us can really do that. Look at this guy. He's huge. And so here comes David. As you read into the story, what you learn is that, again, like I mentioned before, David is one who goes back and forth between the king and his father's sheep. And so he gets special instructions from his father, Jesse, to go and visit his brothers out on the battlefield, because it says there that Jesse's three eldest sons, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, followed Saul into battle. So they're there on the scene, wanting to go into battle, but being confronted by this Philistine. And Jesse says, "Take this food." He gathers this food. We don't have to go into detail of what food he was sending, and take those to your brothers. Get a report from them, and come back and bring back word to me, so I know how they're doing. Okay, so that's David's task. So he goes out to the battlefront, where the armies are situated. Now, what's interesting is what the army is doing and what they're up to when David arrives. When you look at verse 20, I believe. So verse 20, it says, "And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper, and took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry." So it looks like when David arrives, it looks like these are people that they are ready to go out to battle. Okay, it looks like that they're ready to to go out and make war. Now, remember the question that Goliath had asked before. It says, "Why do you line up for battle? Bring somebody to fight me, and we'll do hand-to-hand combat." And remember, it says there earlier in the text that this happened for 40 days, that the Philistine kept coming out. Now, the fact that the Israelites are lining up for battle and they're shouting the battle cry makes me believe, this is what I speculate, but it makes me believe that 40 days have passed, and now maybe there's a period of time, a significant enough period where Goliath doesn't appear anymore. And so maybe they're thinking Goliath isn't going to make any more appearances, so maybe he's gone home, maybe, who knows what's going on with him, but he's not there anymore, so now it's safe for us to go up and go into battle without having to worry about this Philistine guy. So I think maybe that's what's going on. That's what I speculate. That's what I think it might be happening. It's just weird that now they're up at the battlefront and the battle lines, and they're shouting the war cry, the battle cry, as if they're getting ready to go out to battle. So that's what the Israelite army is doing when David arrives. And so when you look at verse 21, and following, it says, "And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army." So they're getting ready to rumble here. "And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, and ran to the ranks, and went and greeted his brothers. And he talked with them. As he talked with him, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him." So I think here again, and who knows, this might be a case of psychological warfare as well, where, maybe the Philistines on their side were thinking, okay, we'll make them think that Goliath has gone away. And so when they get bold enough to start up ready for battle, and we all line up as if we're going to go to war, then out of the ranks, we're going to pull out Goliath, and he's going to do the same thing that he did before when he was appearing for 40 days. Okay, so again, that's why I think that maybe there was a little bit of time that passed after those 40 days. Who knows? But whatever the case, here comes Goliath making the same proposal, making the same challenge that he did before. And did you notice what it said there at the end of verse 23? And it says, "And David heard him." And that's all it really took for David. Once he heard the words of that Philistine, now as a reader, we're going to come head on into learning about the character of a guy who had great confidence in the strength of the Lord and remembered the things that the Lord had done for him. And you see a young man with great confidence who knows that with the Lord he's going to have the ability to slay this Philistine. Now, this isn't just simply a matter where as soon as he hears the Philistine, he's just going to say, "Hey, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do this." Notice he takes note of what everybody around him is saying. And so when the Philistine comes on the scene, it says, like, if you continue on in verse 24, it says, "All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid." So it's the same deal as before. And it said, and continuing on, it says, "And the men of Israel said, 'Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel.' And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And I think that's just a matter of him saying that he's going to be exempt from taxation. I think is what you have there. So those are the rewards that's going to be given to anybody. And it's apparent that this is something that had been discussed and laid out before during the time when Goliath had been making his appearances consistently. And so they know what the king has proposed. And, it looks like a pretty good reward package there. If the person who goes up against Goliath survives to be able to enjoy those rewards. That's the thing, though. You got to come back alive. That's the whole thing. And the people didn't have confidence that they would be able to come back alive. But you notice there in verse 25, it says, "Have you seen this man who has come up?" There you just get the sense from those words, just like the dismay that was described before about this guy that was experienced among Israel about this guy. And so in verse 26 it says, "And David said to the men who stood by him, 'What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?' And the people answered him in the same way, 'So shall it be done to the man who kills him.'" Now, it's interesting because you get the impression that David had already heard the murmurings around of what people were saying before. And he had heard the first time what people were saying. And they were saying that this is what will happen to, the people, the person who goes up against this guy. And, it's interesting because David asked the question again. It seems like what it seems like you have here is that David asked the question again, even though people have been saying this and murmuring about this around him. He says, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel?" You start to see from the language that David starts to use, just kind of, You start to see this, just kind of where David's head is going, this reproach in Israel. And you see more of this as he continues what does he say there? It's still in the middle of verse 26, where he says, "For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Okay? Now, two things that are important here. One, he calls him an uncircumcised Philistine. The fact that he calls him uncircumcised gives us a clue, this understanding of, David, just kind of making a separation between the people of Israel and people like Goliath and the Philistines. By bringing this whole thing of uncircumcised into the equation and pointing out Goliath, specifically this uncircumcised Philistine, which is a term of derision, actually, that he's saying about Goliath, about this Philistine. He's recognizing that this is somebody who is outside of the covenant people of Israel. Now, that's obvious. That's obvious to everybody around him, and that's obvious to us as readers, that when we're dealing with somebody like Goliath, when we're dealing with the Philistines all around, we're dealing with people who are outside of a covenant relationship with Israel. Okay? That's number one. But that, combined with this, number two, where he says that he should defy the armies of the living God. So notice how he labels this here, the army of the living God. In other words, this is the army that belongs to God. So as this person is defying the armies of Israel, what he's actually doing is defying God himself. Okay, because the army of Israel belongs to God. The army of Israel ultimately is led by God. And so by speaking out against the armies of Israel and defying the armies of Israel, what he's doing is defying God himself. And that's bad news. So he's defying the people who are in covenant relationship with God and the army that the God of this people leads. Okay, so you have this uncircumcised outsider of a person who does not have covenant relationship with the one true God, with Yahweh, coming up and speaking against God's army, and therefore speaking against God himself. And so David, the way that he coins that, he expresses that question, again, it says, "For who is this uncircumcised Philistine?" As if to say, who does this guy think he is to speak this way against God. Okay. Now, as David is investigating these things further, we don't have to go into detail about this, but you read in the following verses that Eliab gets mad at David. There's speculation as to why Eliab gets mad at David and snaps at him. Some people, I've heard some suggestions saying that it goes back to the whole thing of jealousy because David, as the youngest, he's the youngest of all the brothers that are in Jesse's house, has been anointed king of Israel, not any of the older brothers. That may be it. There isn't any way to know for sure. But David is one, after Eliab kind of goes after him, he says, what did I do? Can't I say a word? And so in verse 30 it says, and he turned away from him toward another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. So again, there's David getting this repeat. He's asking the repeat question and getting the repeat answer, all of it sounding the same. And so it made me wonder, why is David doing something like this? Now, I'll admit to you that I'm not 100% for sure, but here's my hunch, here's my speculation in all of this. And it goes back to how David, kind of expressed things before. Let's see, back in verse 26, where he says, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away this reproach from Israel?" And again, here's the clincher here, what he says right after. "For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" David's not saying this to himself. He's saying this out loud in front of everybody. Now, David himself is not part of the army, so he's not one who automatically is one who's going to volunteer. But I think in asking the same question and getting repeats over and over again, and having said what he said out loud, I'm wondering if David is wondering if there's anybody in the army who, having heard what David said, would pick up on that and say, yeah, who is this uncircumcised Philistine who defies the armies of God? Who does he think he is? We belong to God's army. And God has promised to be with us in our exploits as long as we live for him, as we obey him, and that sort of thing. And so then maybe there would be courage from somebody who is in the army, who is part of the army, who will say, you know what? I will go up and go. I will go up and face this uncircumcised Philistine, this outsider who has no relationship with the covenant God, covenant relationship with the one true God. And I know who I belong to. I know whose army I belong to. And I know that I can go with the help of God and with his strength and with his power to go up against this Philistine. Maybe that's what David was looking for. And the thing is, he didn't find it. He didn't find it. So by the time David has a meeting with Saul, it's then that David volunteers himself. Again, somebody who's not part of the army volunteers himself to go out and meet the Philistine. So in verse 31, it says, when the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Okay, so there's David raising his hand and saying, I will go. He recognized that everybody's heart is failing out there. Not one man is stepping up, understanding who they are in the army of God and everything like that. Okay? And so, now notice here, the response in verse 33, and Saul said to David, you are not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. So you see, we're looking at, and listen, in some way you can't help but actually see things from Saul's eyes and everybody else's eyes. Okay, there is something to be said about the reality of the situation here. Number one, Saul says you're just a youth, you're just a boy. This guy's way older than you. And number two, he's been a man of war since his youth. So by this time, he, having come up to who he is right now, Saul is saying that this guy has a lot of battle experience, a lot of hand-to-hand experience. Now, how is Saul going to feel about sending a shepherd boy with no military experience up against this man who has the advantage of height and an advantage of fighting experience. And so Saul just straight out says, just looking at things from the human level and looking at everything in front of him and saying, you are not able to do that. You are not able to. Okay? And so David, listen here. David is not going to be one who gives up. And listen, since Saul is the one who brings up resume, at least as it relates to Goliath, David is going to present his own resume, except what he does with this, catch this, what he does with this is that he brings the Lord into this, because his testimony in his resume as a shepherd against lions and bears is that it's the Lord himself who helps him out with this. Now, and then he makes the comparison of what he's going to do with the Philistine. So, check it out here. So in verse 34, it says, "But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered him out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by the beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Now, just to point out a couple of things here, which I think are amazing. Let me just start with what I just read there. The connection that David is making here. In verse 37, he says, "And the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand from the hand of this Philistine." Okay, so David, in his duty as a shepherd, in the times that he's killed a lion or a bear, looks back on that. He says, "This is what was happened to me as a shepherd when one of them carried away a lamb or something like that. I killed them." And so pretty much he's saying it's the Lord. It's not necessarily because of any skill of mine. It's the Lord who allowed me to do this, who gave me the strength to do this, who gave the lion and the bear over into my hands. It's the Lord who does that. And so the Lord is able to help me in the same way here. Now, you notice the description there. It's very interesting because David presents his resume both in an offensive perspective and a defensive perspective. Because it says that if a lion or a bear came and carried away one of the lambs, he would go after it. He would go after it. Now, I don't know how any of you would be, but me, I'm not one who's going to be ready to approach a lion or a bear and attack it. I don't care how many sheep it's trying to drive away or how many sheep it's trying to eat. Yeah, I'm not going to be doing that. I would make a terrible shepherd in that regard. But David was one who says, I go after them. I attack them when they come after the sheep. And then he says, if it arises against me, then I take it by the beard and I strike it. So there's the defensive part of that too. I guess it's kind of defense mixed with offense in that sort of situation. But again, what you see is the bravery of somebody who's going up against, a lion or a bear. These are not cute, cuddly animals that we're dealing with here. These are ferocious animals. And a lion, if you ever seen like a lion, my goodness, tear away at its prey and everything. That's a vicious predator out there. And a bear can do, a lion can too, but a bear can do serious damage. And if you've ever seen the movie The Revenant with Leonardo DiCaprio, it's a movie based on the true story of a man named Hugh Glass in the 1800s. I think it's in the early 1820s or something. This guy was mauled by a bear, and so they depicted that scene in the movie. That's a pretty vicious mauling. Just from what you see on the movie, it's quite a lengthy bear mauling scene. It probably is a few minutes long of Leonardo DiCaprio, getting mauled by a bear. It's not for the faint of heart or the faint of stomach. It's a pretty brutal scene there, the bear mauling scene. But you look at something like that and you think about David's situation, and you think that could very easily be David. That could very easily be David if David is not able to defeat this bear. But he is. And he takes hold of those animals and strikes them down and strikes them dead. Now, here's the thing. Now, David is using his experience as a shepherd against the lion and the bear and paralleling that to what he believes God will be able to do for him and when going up against the Philistine. Here's a good way of looking at this. David recognized that God's hand was with him in striking down animals who were only acting according to their own God-given nature. Realize that? When a lion or a bear or something came and attacked the sheep, when a lion came, for example, would come and take away a lamb, that lion isn't doing anything wrong. You realize that? That lion isn't doing anything wrong or bad. That lion, as a predator, is only acting according to the divine nature that he was created to exhibit. Okay? That's how God created that lion, right? So that lion is just acting according to its God-given nature. But yet, God will intervene to protect David and protect his flock and will give him the ability to kill a lion that's only doing what is within its nature. If that's the case, then why wouldn't God be with David to go against somebody who's coming against the armies of Israel in a very sinful way and speaking against God himself? In other words, somebody who is doing something wrong, unlike the lion or the bear that are just acting according to its nature. See, when you look at it that way, I think you can understand the approach that David is kind of thinking about this here. And one of the great principles that we need to latch onto and just remember is that David was one who was mindful of what God had done for him in the past. That's something that we really need to pay attention to, because I think the truth is, for many of us, and I'll include myself in here because it's been true of me in many parts of my life, we can be very forgetful people. Realize that? We can be very forgetful people. And it doesn't take much. With all the things that are in our society today that are blaring in front of our faces, TV, internet, phones, iPods, iPad, all sorts of things that we fill ourselves with. We can get an exposure to what God does in our lives at one point, and then we easily forget those things because our attention is just all over the place with all sorts of things that are flashed in front of our face. And we're forgetful people. So like when a similar situation in our lives come up where we know that God has worked before, we're in the same spot. It's like, oh no, what am I going to do? I'm in trouble, blah, blah, blah. And we don't give God one thought or two thoughts or three thoughts or any thoughts. And we forgot, hey, God did help me out in a similar situation before. And certainly he can help me out again. So we have to be careful of that. We have to be mindful. We have to be people who are very intent on remembering what God does. And you can do all sorts of things to kind of help you along with that, whether that be journaling and or what have you. But here with David, you're dealing with somebody who knew where his power source came from and knew how God worked in the past. Again, I'm going to bring it up again with animals who are acting according to their nature. And so David, I think, realizes in going against somebody that is, I guess you could say, going by his own nature. If we really want to be theologically correct, he is acting according to nature, but it's just a sinful nature, and he's accountable for it. Nevertheless, somebody who's defying the armies of God in the people of Israel, if that's what the Philistine is doing in a sinful way, then surely God would be with David when he meets this giant, this Philistine. And so David gets Saul's blessing and says, go and may the Lord be with you. Now, just to kind of summarize here, they dress him up in armor and everything, and he has trouble moving through them because he's not used to them. He hasn't tried them out. And so he sheds those. So he's going to go up against this Philistine just as he is. And as it says there in verse 40, it says, then he took his staff in his hand and chose five smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Okay, so here we go. It's showtime, and he just has a staff, his sling, and 5 smooth stones. Now, it turns out he's just going to need one of those stones. Just one, right? And so when he approaches, here you got to imagine the scene here. You have 9 foot tall, close to 10 foot tall Goliath, who recognizes, Goliath is bigger than anybody in the Israelite camp. But he realizes this short runt of a guy who's smaller probably than everybody else, just a young boy who comes up and faces Goliath. Now, in some sense, you got to understand Goliath's response to this. If you were in his sandals, and I'm sure this is hard to imagine because you're not the antagonist like Goliath is, but if you're in his sandals and you're issuing this challenge, and this is how they respond by sending David, a smaller person than everybody else and younger. And it says, let's see here. Verse 41, and the Philistine moved forward and came near to David and his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. In other words, he's saying, are you kidding me? This is what you send to me? This young boy here? You got to be out of your mind. Now, here's where, okay. Well, let's look at what he goes on to say in verse 44. The Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Now, verse 45 and following here. I love this. This is where I want us to hone in a little bit here. Verse 45, it says, Then David said to the Philistine, You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Okay, now let's stop right there for a second. Let's establish what David is not saying. Okay, let's get that out of the way. David is not saying that in any situation with Israel, them going to battle with swords, spears, javelins, and anything like that is wrong and is a demonstration of lack of faith in what God is able to do on the battlefield. That's not what he's saying. He's not saying that swords and spears and stuff are useless in fighting or in war. But what he's saying is to Goliath is that, look, you come to me thinking that you put your hope in these tools that you have in your possession. I come to you with something different. Now, in the heat of battle, when you're talking about armies and stuff, you can still use instruments and armor and swords and spears and everything like that and still be carried on by God, not understanding that it is not those things in and of themselves that bring the victory. Okay? You read in other places and you read in places like the Psalms and stuff where it talks about not putting your strength in horses. In other words, the strength of horses, that would refer to chariots and things like that. Implements of war within battle and things like that. Nothing wrong with having them, but when you depend on them and saying, this is what I put my hope in, that's where the problem is. And so David, now remember, he's left his armor and everything behind. He wasn't used to them. He's just armed with a staff, and he's got 5 smooth stones and a sling. That's all he's got. And even now, he's not flinching. And he's saying to Goliath, you come to me with these instruments, but I come to you. Here's what he's saying. He's saying, I'm coming to you with something better, or rather someone better. Okay? And he's saying this to somebody who just cursed him by his gods, right? He says, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel. In other words, he's saying, he's saying that this is part of the army that belongs to God. In other words, this is the army that God himself leads. Which, by the way, at the end of that whole thing at verse 45, it says, whom you have defied. Okay, so he threw that in there. It says, this God that leads our army, guess what? You defied him. You defied him. That's what he's getting at there. Now, It says there, "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand." Notice notice he's not coming out and saying, I'm going to mess you up, and I'm going to do it, and I'm going to, it's really not anything like that. I mean, he does speak that way. I mean, if you continue to read, but his mindset is on the fact that the Lord is the one who does the fighting for him. And so that's how he starts out. He says, "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth." Now listen to this. I love this. That all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and He will give you into our hand. Now, there's some good stuff in there. I want to just take a moment to just kind of glean that out of here. This is just really the crux of just when you see what kind of person David is. We've seen a lot of him up to this point, but I mean, the words that he uses here and what he says to Goliath are things that are very telling about his perspective of God and what his motivation is in his relationship with God. Did you notice what he says there? He says, I'll just read it again. He says, "I will," all the bold words that he's saying that, he says, "And I will give the dead bodies of the hosts of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth." And of course, this isn't anything that he would say if he didn't know that God, that if he didn't believe that God was with him. Now, here's the reason why. This is the reason why he says what he says, and this is why he says he's going to do what he's going to do. "That all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." This is a testimony demonstration. He's wanting this power to be displayed through him, so that God can earn a name for himself in all the earth. Remember, in all the earth. That's what he's saying. David wants God to earn a name for himself. Is that what we want? Whenever we're in a situation, use your imagination, or maybe you can use a real life example of stuff that's happened in your own life, and we want to see God work powerfully in our lives. Do we have a strong desire in the moment to have God work powerfully through us, not only simply so much for helping us in whatever situation we're in, but also so that his fame may spread as a result of it? Think about that. That's where David's head was. David's head was so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. In other words, and listen, he's saying that there is a God in Israel. In other words, he's saying, here's another way of putting it, so that all the earth may be put on notice that God is with the people of Israel. That's what he's saying. He's saying that it may be known in all the earth that there is a God in Israel. Okay. And this is what God was able to do to this giant of a man who's a Philistine and to the rest of the army. And word will spread and everybody else will learn about it. Now, remember what we talked about last week when we were talking about Joshua and, the fall of Jericho and everything. We were talking about the spies. Remember what Rahab said. Rahab said that word about you is spread. We know what happened at the Red Sea, so many years ago. And we heard about what you recently did to those Amorite kings, Sihon and Og. And because of that, everybody here in this city, their heart melts with fear because of that. What is that? That fame, the fame of God spread to different places, and it spread to Jericho and even beyond Jericho, probably. And I think that's what David was looking for here. David wants God's fame to be spread and to let it be known that there is a God in Israel, that this is Israel's God, and God stands by them. But not only that, so that's from an outer perspective. But here, you know what I believe that we have here? Look at verse 47. Here's another thing he says. "And that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." Okay. Now, who's this assembly? I think that what David is referring to there is the assembly of Israel. Remember what he's been seeing this whole time and what he's been trying to fish out the whole time when he's been speaking to them when Goliath appeared to them. What he's experienced is people who have been afraid, who've been fearful. People say, we can't go out against this Philistine, and you see what this Philistine is saying, blah, blah, blah. Nobody had the courage to go up against this Philistine. Because everybody, from their human eyes were saying, we don't have the resources. None of us has the resources to go up against this Philistine and to secure a victory. None of us has anything. I mean, we could take our best material, and I don't think that we can beat these guys. I think that's what David was picking up on, no matter who he spoke to when he was in the Israelite camp. And so what he's saying is that no, not only will your defeat and the defeat of the Philistines serve as an example that there's a God in Israel to all the earth, but this is also going to serve as an example and a testimony to my people as well, my Israelite brothers and sisters. Well, brothers. I mean, there aren't any sisters out there, so women weren't in the war. So brothers, I guess you could say. My fellow companions who are back there in the army. That's the other reason, that's the other motivation that he has here. So that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear. That's the message that he wanted them to learn, his own people to learn. That doesn't mean that David was saying that you go into battle without sword and spear. That every time you go out in the battlefield, just go out there empty-handed. That's not what he's saying. Obviously, that's not what he's saying when you read further. I mean, David leads armies and he slays people. That requires weapons. So that's not what he's saying at all. What he's saying is that ultimately what secures the victory is not the weapons that you have in your hand, but it's the Lord who guides you in the use of those weapons. And that even if you don't have the requisite weapons for warfare, like David here, I mean, even it got rid of his protective defensive gear because he wasn't used to them. But with David, it's okay because he understands that the battle ultimately isn't won with sword and spear. Okay. Now, let me just say this. That's not to say that any army, let's say the United States Army, can suddenly adopt this mindset and say we can just go out there, because the battle isn't won by RPGs and rocket launchers and grenades and machine guns, but it's by the power of the Lord. That's not a parallel application, because again, Israel's army did belong to God. That's part of a covenant thing between God and the people of Israel. Okay, so you can't compare that with any other army, U.S. Army, any other army that's out there. That's not what we're dealing with. Okay, we're dealing with a uniquely set apart people in covenant relationship who promised to be with Israel in their military campaigns as long as they were living in obedience. Okay. So I just want to make that clear so that, we understand we're not dealing with the same thing here in our day. But the perspectives that we can draw from this are very useful and very helpful when it comes to how we can apply these things to different parts of our lives. Now, he wants this message to be given to the assembly just based on how everything is going to go down, that the Lord saves not with sword and spear. For, this is the end of verse 47, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. That's beautiful. The battle is the Lord's. Sometimes we get caught in situations where we try and fight battles that aren't our own, and we don't have the strength to fight those battles. We try and fight God's battles on our own strength, and it's not going to work. The thing is, David says that the battle is the Lord's. And of course, the battle is the Lord's in this situation because really, ultimately, at the end of the day, like I've mentioned before, it's the Lord that Goliath is ultimately defying. And that's what you have there. It's the Lord himself that he's actually speaking against. And so the Lord is going to meet Goliath in battle. So in a sense, what a lot of the people were thinking is true. They're thinking, I can't go against Goliath. That's true. They can't go against Goliath in his own strength. God is the one who supplies the power, and it's God who Ultimately, here's how you can put it. Ultimately, it's God himself who faces down Goliath. Now, of course, he uses a small person like David in his youth to do that, but Goliath brought forth the fighting words. God is the one who met Goliath and defeated him. So really, the battle was between Goliath and God. Again, not saying that David is God, it's just saying that God used David. And you can see, just by what happens here. I mean, this is an unusual killing. I mean, this doesn't seem like it says there in the following verses, in verse 48 and following, it says, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his and fell on his face to the ground. Really, that's all it took. That's all it took. You're like, what? And something like that gives you an indication that we're dealing with something that's truly something that's from the power of God. And that's what we see there. Now, of course, we don't have to go through the rest of the text here, but as the story goes on to say that David stood over the body, he took the Philistine sword and cut off his head. And then the Israelites advanced on the Philistines, and they enacted a massive defeat against the Philistines. So it was a great day of victory that was sparked by David's victory over Goliath with the help of the Lord, right? And so that's what you have there. And so that's what you have with the story of David and Goliath. Now, of course, notice that the actual killing of Goliath, of him with the stone and the sling and hitting Goliath in the head and him falling down and dying, we only talked about that for like a minute. And that's and again, we know the story of David and Goliath. What's the thing that people focus on? David killed Goliath. We only spent like a minute talking about the actual slaying of Goliath. And the reason is because there's so much leading up to that. What you see in the slaying is the result of things that lead up to that point. Those things that we covered when looking at this situation between David and Goliath. Okay. There you were dealing with somebody with the confidence that God was able to use him to fight God's battle, because it says the battle is the Lord's. Okay. And David was one who, let's just keep these in mind as we draw our time to a close, that David was one who was mindful of what God had done for him in the past. Okay. So he wasn't forgetful about what God had done for him in dangerous situations with lions and bears and such. David was one who wanted to act passionately for the glory of the Lord, because he wanted this to be a testimony to the people of all over the earth. And number 3, he wanted the lesson to be learned among his own people about the strength of God and how this is his battle. And that you don't need to put your hope in these things in order to see the Lord at work. Okay? And so that's the thing that we need to grab hold of. Now, of course, that's not saying that we need to subscribe to things like, what you see in Christian Science and stuff. You get sick, well, don't take medicine. You just rely on the Lord, that sort of thing. That's foolish. Don't do that. Again, like I said, what David is not talking about here. He's not talking about never going into battle with sword and spear and everything like that. And again, we know that because David proceeded to do that as a leader of Israel's army throughout the narrative. Okay. But what he's saying is that in the Lord's battle, the Lord will bring about a victory in his own way. And it doesn't have to be by by things that we know of human material, of human tactics, of human skill. Remember, Goliath was a man of skill. Here you have a shepherd boy with no military experience that we can know of or we think of. He's just known as somebody who looked after his father's sheep. And yet it didn't take much for him to defeat Goliath. Why? Because God was on his side. And it was the Lord's battle. So the Lord was the one who was fighting Goliath, if you really want to get down to it, like I mentioned before. So really it's God versus Goliath. David was just the instrument by which God used to defeat Goliath. And so who's the victor in this whole thing? God. Of course, God. God's not going to lose. God's not going to lose, as made very apparent in the story that we see with David and Goliath. All right. So I would encourage you, maybe, because again, like with just like in some of the other stories that we've explored on Loving the Scriptures, we just looked at certain highlights. We didn't go through a verse by verse sort of thing or look at everything in the chapter. And again, chapter 17 of 1 Samuel is a long chapter. Take some time to read it carefully on your own. Okay. And mull over it and just see what God reveals to you in that time in a closer, in-depth study of that. And I think that even in that, God will be able to show you great things. Okay, so we will leave it there. If you enjoy this show and you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to subscribe to my show on Apple Podcasts. Also follow Loving the Scriptures on Twitter. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. Okay, so next time, one more look at a childhood classic. Again, try and think and see if you can guess what we're going to look at next week. And again, my clue is I've mentioned it before. It's been in a previous episode, so whether you remember it or not, whatever. But we'll look at we'll look at one more of those. And then after that, what we'll probably do is we'll probably take a week to consider Christ and Christmas, just as that time approaches, and probably look at some things there. I'm thinking more along the lines of looking at another passage in Luke chapter 2 to kind of prepare our hearts for Christmas. So I haven't nailed that down in stone yet. It's just as far as what we're going to look at as far as that's concerned, but that's kind of sort of where I'm leaning right now. So anyway, so that's it. Like I said, we'll leave it there. My name is Steve Gill, and I will see you right back here next time. Bye now.